So welcome, everybody. Thanks very much for joining us today. We are lucky to have two distinguished co-authors of the great recent book, or coming out very shortly, Machine, Platform, and Crowd. Let me introduce Andy McAfee and Erik Brynjolfsson, who are both distinguished professors at the Sloan School at MIT and co-directors of the MIT Initiative on the Digital Economy. I thought we'd start off by asking them to tee up the thesis and main themes of their books for a few minutes. I've got a few questions to ask about both this book and their prior book, The Second Machine Age, and we'd love to open it up to all of you, both in the room and in offices around the country. So with that, let me turn it over to you guys for a quick overview of the book. We've known each other for some years at a variety of different sessions, and my favorite description of all the wonderful things that could be said about Andy and Erik is that the FT Review called them the pinup boys for the Davos crowd. So I'm not sure if you can outdo that, but with that
Think about what that says about the rest of the Davos crowd. Just ponder that for a second.
Yeah, grading on a curve. But we would only be talking for this session, though, just to get your expectations set properly.
So tell us a little bit about the book. You're coming off The Second Machine Age, which is a lot about the economic transitions in the United States. What's the next chapter in that story that you wanted to tell with this book?
So coming off the last book, I think we heard a lot of people saying, okay, we get what you're saying, that the world is changing, there are these things happening with technology, and the economy is being affected. What now? What should we be doing to take advantage of this? And a little bit more about how businesses can react. And we saw really three big rebalancings happening. One of them was between mind and machine. One of them was between product and platform. And the third one was between the core and the crowd. First, we thought we'd put all those words in the title, but then our names wouldn't fit in 18-point type, so we had to reduce the number of words a little bit. So the first one is one you guys are all very familiar with, this rebalancing between mind and machine, that machines, first off, are helping a lot of humans make better decisions, data-driven decision-making, whether it's helping the Golden State Warriors use analytics to understand that 3-point shots are worth more than 2-point shots and other things like that. Or
you wouldn't think you'd need analytics for that, but...
Well, apparently I wasn't well understood until recently. And there may have been some more subtle things that they pulled out as well. And of course, before that, it was their neighbors, the Oakland A's and the Boston Red Sox, who won a series of 3 world championships between them. And then it's coming to more and more businesses. We've got about a 3 times increase in the use of data-driven decision-making. That, by the way, we've measured it across American plants. And even in our own industry, tenure analytics. We are using analytics to try to predict who's going to get tenure at top universities, who's going to get prizes. And then it turns out that it can out-predict the tenure committees in terms of who does better performance. But that's just the first part of that. More and more, as you guys know, artificial intelligence is making decisions on their own. And I won't even go into all that because you guys are very familiar with that. The second big rebalancing is between products and platforms. 5 of the biggest companies by market cap are platform companies. Google, Alphabet here, Facebook, Amazon, Apple, and Microsoft. But it's lots of smaller companies that are coming up and growing, sometimes almost out of nowhere, becoming multi-billion-dollar companies, leveraging platforms and trying to understand that trade-off between products and platforms and why those are so much more powerful now. And thirdly, between the core and the crowd. Tapping into the millions, actually billions of brains around the planet is something that we can do now because we have a global interconnected digital network that allows people to communicate that way in a way that they couldn't have previously, and not just to access information, but to contribute to it. So this helps us understand, to make sense of some of the weird things that are happening in the economy, the companies that are being destroyed, new companies being created, and there's some underlying economic principles in each of these areas of product, machine, platform, and crowd, and laying out the phenomena that are happening with lots of case studies, and then the economic principles. In each case, it turns out there are some Nobel Prize-winning economics that drive each of these changes, and that can help us make sense of that. So that was the basic strategy of what we were trying to do with machine, platform, and crowd. And we're hoping that we continue to have this kind of dialogue. We're looking forward to some questions and comments from all of you to see what the challenges are that you're facing, the opportunities you're facing, and see how well we can map them into the frameworks we've developed. Andy?
Yeah, what he said. First of all, Kent, thank you for hosting us. It's a pleasure and a real privilege to come back. We've learned a lot from Google over the years. It's always a pleasure to come back and talk with you all. I want to also thank Andrew and your team at Google.org. Google.org is a supporter of our Inclusive Innovation Challenge back at MIT, where we're trying to reward innovators and entrepreneurs who are improving economic prospects for average income and below average income workers. A lot of us in this room know that the narrative these days is that technology is killing jobs, and it's not too far from that narrative to therefore technology is a bad thing. We think that's a really harmful road to go down. So we're trying to, with the IIC, we're trying to celebrate organizations that are using technology to bring economic opportunity. We're really happy to have Google.org on board with us for that. And then finally, thank you all for showing up today. I know you probably have a lot of things to do. It's a pleasure to have you here. I want to tell the origin story of this book because Erik and I wrote The Second Machine Age together. And we kind of thought we were done writing books about this period of crazy tech progress that we were in. And we noticed as soon as we finished that book that people who run companies kept on approaching us in the hallways, honestly, of places like Davos. And they kept on saying, essentially, I believe your story, now what do I do? And in some cases, I got the impression that there was actually some desperation behind the question that they were asking. The people were successful, they were running large, successful organizations, and I started to get the impression that they were at sea. They were really floundering or foundering about what this technology surge, that they understood at some level. They didn't have a great way to think about what this was going to do to their business, to their organization, and to their industry. And that became kind of this recurring conversation that we had. And I found it profoundly interesting because I didn't understand at first why they were so lost. These were smart, successful, experienced, well-educated executives, and they felt really just deer in headlights with what was coming at them. And then as Erik and I did the work, I realized that I should have been less surprised by that because the mantra about technology that I'm repeating to myself these days is that tech progress rewrites the business playbook. And we're in one of those stages right now where the two of us believe the playbook for how you run a successful business is being substantially rewritten by the kinds of new technologies that we're seeing. The last time I think this happened was just about a century ago when manufacturing went from being steam-powered to being electric-powered. And there was a naive way to think about that, which was take out the big steam engine in the basement of the factory, replace it with a big electric motor in the basement of the factory. And a lot of companies did that. That was kind of a no-brainer. What we learned from business history is that the companies and leaders, business leaders who grew up in the era of steam, it's not that they were unwilling to invest in electricity. It's not that they thought electricity sucked. It's that honestly they could not, their minds did not admit the possibility of an overhead crane or a conveyor belt or an assembly line. These things did not make sense if you had a factory powered by belts and shafts and pulleys and steam in the basement. This was just crazy talk. And you can go back and read the literature from those early decades of the 20th century, and there are these vicious debates about should we put a motor on every machine in the factory? Like that was nutty for decades, even though it's completely obvious in retrospect. So the homework that Erik and I had for ourselves was to think of these days, what are the equivalents of overhead cranes and assembly lines and conveyor belts that forward-thinking companies are on top of, and that ones who are trapped in previous mindsets and previous ways of thinking are just not going to see. And that led to our three-part answer. I see a lot of companies underestimating the power of machines, a lot of companies underestimating the power of platforms, and a lot of companies not doing a great job of tapping into the crowd out there.
So for a company like ours, we feel very much in the middle of a lot of these phenomena. You start your book with an example of AlphaGo, with DeepMind. The platform, obviously, we have a number of different things that have platform-like characteristics, Android and a lot of others. And even on crowd, you can argue that Google Search is the greatest man-machine collaboration in history as people use our systems and improve the systems through their clicks.
Right.
So what would be your advice for Google? What do you think we're getting wrong? What do you think we should be doing differently?
And I see we're just about out of time. Thank you all for coming.
You're doing a lot of things right. And so I think that one of the risks is that in a way you may become too successful. And I think one of the things that we don't talk that much about in the book, but I think what we're going to see is that as we get more of a winner-take-most economy, And very successful companies are able to use those technologies to dominate market after market because they understand those three platforms, and other companies are just beginning to get them. Then there can be a backlash and a pushback against that. And one of the questions is, what kind of economy are we in going forward? Is it one where there's monopoly capitalism, or is it what, as we talk about in the book, more of a Schumpeterian creative destruction, where there's always the risk of one platform being displaced by another? But understanding this, the economics are a little bit different in a world where there are very strong network effects, or even two-sided network effects, and there are some big scale economies, and very rapid technological change. And that's something that I know that you're very much on top of, is understanding those kinds of dynamics. And relatedly, something we touched on in the last book, is this winner-take-all or winner-take-most dynamic. It doesn't just apply to companies, it can apply to individuals as well. So we're seeing growing inequality on a lot of different dimensions. And it's great, as Andy mentioned, that Google.org is helping to identify business models that can create more broadly shared prosperity as another counterweight against a world where all of the wealth and perhaps political power gets more concentrated.
Ken, I think this is a great question. I want to answer not specifically about Google, but about companies full of smart people. And at the risk of flattering people in this room and watching us, okay, there are a lot of smart people working at Google. The single biggest failure mode that I've observed related to the content of the book when I talk to audiences of very smart people is that smart people tend to have an exaggerated version of a failure mode that everybody has, which is to be too fond and too confident and too reliant on their own intuition, judgment, experience, intelligence. And they're very often guilty of some of these cognitive biases that Erik mentioned, Nobel Prizes, that Danny Kahneman got a Nobel Prize for figuring out. The failure mode among really smart people is to trust themselves too much. And one of the points we make, the broad point we make in the first section of the book is, look, your intuition is awesome. It is demonstrably buggy and failure-ridden, and it's got all kinds of really powerful, pretty bad news failure modes. The fact that your IQ is well above the average does not insulate you from that, and in some ways it can make that worse. Overconfidence bias tends to be worse among really smart people. So the point we make in the first section of the book is to hammer that point home and make people feel bad about themselves, but then to say, look, we have these awesome colleagues now called machines that have very different failure modes than people do. They're not inconsistent, they're not overconfident, but they're really stupid about the world. There's a wonderful concept from linguistics. It's called the intuition of the native speaker. I can recognize a grammatically faulty English sentence just in the blink of an eye, immediately. And people who don't speak English as a first language can't do that. The reason I bring that up, we have native speaker intuition about the world. Even with all the work you guys are doing, our machines don't have that yet. So one of the broad points we try to make is let's bring together the strengths of minds and machines. If we do that correctly, I think we can cancel out each other's failure modes. The big homework, especially for smart people, is to become more aware of the failure modes of humanity and more willing to question yourself, second guess yourself, use data, use machines to buttress the mistakes that our wetware has.
And there are lessons from the other two sections of the book as well. I mean, you guys know Joy's law that no matter what company you work for, most of the smart people in the world don't work for your company.
Yep.
And it's probably even true for Google. That may be the edge case. So it's great that Google, we were just last night with Anthony Goldblum, co-founder of Kaggle, and it's great to see Google tapping into the power of the crowd and all of those smart people elsewhere that are not contributing, and the AI initiatives that are allowing people to contribute in different ways, use TensorFlow and other things to tap into that crowd knowledge. And on platforms, I mean, yes, Google has not just one, but multiple great platforms. But as we describe in the book, those are constantly evolving. As the technology changes, there's always a risk of them being displaced. And of course, there's new ones rising up as you go from as Sundar Pichai said, a mobile-first to an AI-first world. That kind of transition, Microsoft kind of bobbled that, going from desktops to mobile. And there's these constant risks. So because of the rapid change that we were just talking about, you can't sit back and feel like, okay, we've got the problem solved. We can just relax. I think the lessons in all three sections of the book apply to Google.
Let's talk a little bit about time scale. We get very excited about this. We feel it's the ocean we swim in. And yet, and your example about electrification, it took 50 years to disseminate the effects of electrification through society in a broad way. If you look at something like the cell phone, was conceived of in 1947, demoed in 1973, sold in 83, and it really wasn't until the turn of the century or later until it became widely adopted. So are we overestimating how quickly all this is coming along, or do you think this is right around the corner?
I think especially the geekier set is overestimating how quickly these things are going to happen, how quickly the cars are going to drive themselves, and we talk to AI in our homes and everything happens and the drones deliver stuff. I think we are overestimating that. However, I do think that a lot of people are underestimating that. And in the communities that Erik and I try to be part of, there's a super active debate about how soon is X going to happen. And a lot of people rely on those historical examples that you just brought up and say, look, this is a decades-long process. My favorite counter to that is, how old is Facebook? 2004-ish?
Yeah, 5, yeah.
Facebook has 1.9 billion users around the world. Like close to a third of humanity has adopted this technology in the space of 15 years-ish. We have never, ever seen this before. So in a world that is interconnected with pretty powerful devices and where the cloud is available on demand almost everywhere, and where really powerful tools are being put up into the cloud, the timescales can be quicker than we're used to.
And I would make a distinction between those two examples you gave. I think Andy's exactly right that the technology, I think, is evolving a lot faster than the cell phone did. But what doesn't seem to be moving a lot faster is our ability to adapt the business process change. And that's what held back electricity. Electricity was, the technology was there for a good several decades before the factories reinvented their business processes and reinvented their organizations. And there are some technologies that can be adopted, without a whole lot of business process change, like a consumer-facing product like Facebook. But a lot of the ones that really have big societal changes are going to require a lot more adjustment. In self-driving cars, it's going to be not just a matter of having them navigate the vehicles. There's a whole set of laws, ethics, customs that are going to have to evolve.
This must keep you up at night thinking about all the barriers that come up.
And those don't evolve at Moore's Law types of speeds. One of the big reasons we wrote this book,
lawyers like geologic time.
Yeah, more like geological time.
They go backwards slowly.
And that's why we wrote the book. But hopefully that we can move the dial a little bit on that. I think if people understand how to take advantage of these technologies, if they understand the process change necessary, we can make it happen a little bit faster. Once we give them a bit of a playbook about what works and what doesn't work.
And it's also true that the progress is really going to be piecemeal. So nationwide, fully autonomous cars. That might be a bit off. We were talking to Vinod Khosla yesterday, and he brought up that one company that he's aware of is trying to just think about automating driving trucks between, Dallas?
Phoenix and
Dallas
LA,
and LA. He said, let's just do that. There's $1 billion of commerce. That's $1 billion market, just driving trucks back and forth between those two cities. Can we get regulatory approval for the states on the route? And that's one route. We know how to map that pretty easily. So that can happen pretty quickly.
And part of it was not do all the little side streets at each city.
Exactly.
Just get it onto the highway and
then
boom,
text some person to show up and drive it.
Yeah.
It's going to take a while to completely rewire and put sensors all over the electric grid and get the efficiencies that we're hoping for with that. At the same time, the thought experiment that I run is how much work would it be for some kind of industrial facility to slap sensors on everything, give it to TensorFlow, and maybe get the kind of 15-ish% step change improvement that the Google data center saw when they turned over operations to a cousin of the AlphaGo technology. So there are going to be relatively quick, big wins happening all over the economy, I think.
Now, let's talk a little bit about the social implications of that. It's something you covered in depth in Second Machine Age, but continues to be very relevant. When we talk about driverless cars, immediately there's concern about employment transition and displacement. There's sort of the standard response of more training and perhaps either earned income tax credit or universal basic income. Yet training has been kind of a mixed success rate. There are not a lot of great case studies there. People trying to do new things, online training and the like. Interested in your thoughts on that, and more generally on the balance between our need for growing productivity as our workforce ages and potential impacts on social structures and employment.
There's no silver bullet here. And I think there are a lot of people, and was wonderful, if you look far enough ahead, it's going to be very hard for education to keep up. But I think where we are right now in 2017, and as far as I can tell for the next 5, 10 more years, training and education is probably at the top of my list. I think most economists' list of what's
Not mine.
Okay. So Andy can weigh in on that. But there's different kinds of training education. So some of them give very specific tasks. You know, what Sebastian Thrun and company are doing at Udacity, you can learn some skills quite rapidly, add a great deal of value. Tom Khalil described something that DARPA did called the Education Dominance Program, that in 90 or 120 days would give people some very concrete skills that massively increased their value. The more lasting skills are going to be the ones around interpersonal skills, creativity, teamwork, persuasion, some of the softer skills that machines aren't very good at. I don't think our schools are doing a very good job of teaching those, or worse yet, I think many of them are actually crushing them and making them less salient. So
How many of us feel like we had some of the love of learning crushed out of us by our education? Just honestly, show of hands.
Yeah.
Way up in the air, please. Look around the room.
Yeah.
This is a crime.
This is a crime because I think most kids, actually, they love being creative. Put a pile of blocks in front of a 3-year-old, the first thing they'll do is stop building something, or crayons. Kids, humans love creating. And if we could nurture that and let that flourish, that is what machines are not very good. Playing and interacting with other people, teamwork, that's what machines aren't very good at. So it's not just a matter of spending more in education, although I don't think that would hurt, I think that would help, but it's a matter of more fundamentally reinventing education. There are so many tasks in our economy still that only humans can do, and that's the way it's going to be for a while. So I'm not ready to write off human skills. I think we should invest and make people ready to do all those different kinds of human tasks in healthcare, education, childcare, creative works, and that's going to be the way that one of the ways we create more shared prosperity. But you may disagree, Andy.
I agree with everything you just said. Here's why I disagree with an education reform first approach to fixing things. My thought experiment is, let's say there is a pot of money available and you could do only one thing with it. And I have 3 kind of prime candidates in my mind. Number 1 is reform education, and let's say it's going to cost something to do
What
that.
number was that?
What? The amount of money?
No, what number was that? That was number 1?
Not in descending order.
Oh,
okay.
all right.
Option A is to reform education. Option B is to figure out why entrepreneurship in America has been on a long, slow, steady decline and reverse that. Option C is to bring our infrastructure up from a grade of D+ to maybe a solid B. I would actually take either option B or C over option A. I'm not saying that I'm right, and I'm not saying it's a no-brainer, but I would love to solve either of those latter 2 problems first. I fall back on something that Larry Summers says in his inimitable fashion whenever somebody brings up education. He said, education reform is kind of a dodge, and unless we grow the economy faster, we're not going to be doing a lot for jobs and wages. That's a very strong way to say it, but to grow the economy faster, I would love to figure out why entrepreneurship is sucking in America, and I would love to fix our infrastructure, which is just the biggest no-brainer out there.
But the good news is we don't have to choose just one of those. I think that there is no silver bullet, as I said. We should be doing all of these things simultaneously, and some of them government can help with. A lot of these we can do without having government involved, and maybe, depending on which way the winds are blowing, it may be that we have to take more responsibility as individuals or as organizations to step up on some of these other dimensions.
I completely agree with that, without a reservation this time. And one of the really encouraging things, one of the really encouraging things in education is the rise of these really alternative ways to get really powerful skills, to get credentials, and to signal how good you are at stuff. That's a case where the government has been lagging in many cases. And in fact, because student loans are only given to accredited institutions, in some ways the government is impeding progress in these areas. Now, I don't think I'm a frothing at the mouth libertarian, but I would like to see that situation change.
So let me ask one more question, then open it up to questions from all of you. We don't have mics around the room, so please just shout out the question. We'll repeat it back so we catch it on the mic and for people remotely.
And can people at the desks ask questions too? Is there a way to get
Yes, so I was going to say, so Andrew has the doorway available, which is running a constant number of questions and actually voting on those questions. So
and you have a retinal implant that is giving you access.
We're tracking them. It's all in TensorFlow.
God, we
The
love
best
coming
questions
here.
will surface the top. But let me step back before we open it up to everybody and ask about the global implications of this. I mean, there have been some who've argued that the growing use of robots and industrialization is blocking paths has the development
Yeah.
that have traditionally been available for evolving countries. Darren Acemoglu argues that every time you employ a robot, you don't employ 3 to 5 people. What's your take on that? How do you see this playing out globally?
Well, let's touch on the global one first. So Andy and I, along with Michael Spence, one of our friendly Nobel Prize winning colleagues, wrote an article about some of the implications for globalization. And that was a couple of years ago in Foreign Affairs. And we talked about this challenge that in many ways, although technology has been one of the best things that happened to the globe, and as you probably know, there are a lot fewer people in poverty now than there were 20 years ago, and a lot of the trends are very good. If you look a little further into the future, there are some storm clouds, and in particular, countries that are right now depending on manufacturing to be that engine to lift them out of poverty are very much in the bullseye of a lot of the automation. You go visit, China, and you see thousands of people working side by side doing very routine, simple tasks that a lot of you guys could probably write some code to get
in about 20 minutes
to do those tasks. And those workers were able to compete very effectively against American or German or Swiss workers at lower wages. But you don't want to be competing on the basis of wages against a robot. And so that means that middle class that's been created in a lot of developing countries is now going to have to compete with robots that can work for $4, $2, $1 an hour equivalent. And that's not a good place to be. They need to leapfrog to a situation where they're doing more of that creative and interpersonal work. For better or worse, there's not that many manufacturing workers in American factories anymore. I mean, it's less than 10% of the workforce. You go to most factories, it's kind of lights out. So we are in some ways going to be less affected by that kind of automation of factory work than those developing countries. And it may make it harder for them to make that transition. Some countries like China, they have a very sophisticated tech economy as well. So they've got a good chunk of the people on the other side of that curve. Other countries like Vietnam, the Philippines, are going to have a harder time making that transition.
The way I look at your question, there are 2 unmistakable big global trends related to the things that we're talking about. One is betterment, is improvement in the human condition. We've had the largest declines in dire poverty that we've ever seen around the world. We've had the biggest increases in human health in recent decades that we've ever seen around the world. Do you all know the site Our World in Data? This is my favorite site because you walk away just happy after you go look at almost any aspect of it. So the first one is that the world, almost without exception, is getting better in the areas that we care about. That's the first trend. The second one is concentration. And it gets to this notion that we are doing more and more manufacturing on a smaller and smaller geographic footprint, a smaller and smaller employment footprint, a smaller and smaller number of companies' footprint. Wealth is getting more concentrated. Income is getting more concentrated. It almost doesn't matter where you look. This trend is really pronounced. Now, I don't know if those 2 trends are going to continue to interact kind of happily, or if there's kind of a clash of the titans that's coming when these cost declines implicit in Moore's law meet rising wages in Bangladesh and China and places like that. Those 2 trends could run kind of headlong into each other. I don't know that's what's going to happen, but that's something to keep our eyes on.
Great. Okay, so let's open it up to the room, and Andrew's ready if we don't have questions, but first.
So the question has to do with, on one hand, we see increasing returns to scale and perhaps more concentration of wealth. Certainly we have seen that. And on the other hand, we see this decline in productivity. And are those 2, not decline in productivity, let me be more precise, a slower rate of productivity growth. It's still growing. And are these possibly connected? And I think there are some people who are making that case, Joe Stiglitz and others, that there's this rise of a rentier economy, people rent-seeking. I don't see it quite yet. It's something I'd like to keep my eyes open and take a look at. I think that some of the areas where you're seeing these increasing returns to scale are actually some of the more dynamic parts of the economy. So I would look elsewhere. If you look at the part where there's been less entrepreneurship, where there are fewer young new firms, they're not in those parts of the economy where we're seeing the network effects and so forth. So I would look to other things. There's issues around occupational licensing. There's just the aging of the workforce, and I see everyone here is pretty young, but sadly, when people get older, they don't get to be as entrepreneurial.
Trust us, there are old people working in America. I know that's weird for you all to believe.
And most of them are not starting companies. And so that's part of it. It is honestly a little bit of a mystery. The people who study this, like John Halterwang and others, they're not quite sure what's going on there in terms of that effect. In terms of the other drivers of productivity growth, well, I think we see, we've been talking about these wondrous things, The other thing we have to bear in mind is that most of them haven't really hit the marketplace yet. Andy and I rode in a self-driving car, the first book, and again, more recently, which is a lot of fun. But there aren't a whole lot of them out there on the highways or most of the other amazing technologies. We're excited. I think folks in Silicon Valley are excited because we can see what's in the pipeline. But in terms of measurable effects on productivity, right now we are really harvesting more what happened in the 1990s in terms of technology. I mean, back in 1997, the same Silicon Valley folks were excited about e-commerce. But did it really make a dent on traditional retailing? Not until 2017. And the past couple of weeks, you've been reading a lot about that. So there's a pretty significant lag between when you see these wondrous technologies and when they're going to show up in the productivity statistics. And that, I think, is probably more of the explanation behind some of those two trends you described.
We have a rock star colleague back at MIT named John Van Reenen who dove into exactly the question that you're asking. And he documented that in industry after industry, there are these superstar firms that are appearing, a small number of them. They're sucking up a lot of the revenue, lots and lots of the profits in industry after industry, not just in high tech. And he says that might explain some of the trends that you brought up. So the interesting thought experiment is Amazon good or bad for overall retail productivity? And my initial answer is got to be awesome for it. Well, if all the other companies in retail are seeing slowly eroding revenue and they're not laying off people in droves yet, then overall productivity for that sector could actually be slowing down or declining because of Amazon sucking all the energy up into one really concentrated place. So the data, we got to dive deeper in it. It's a fundamentally important question, and there are a couple different promising lines of research here.
And one more to just touch on briefly that the Amazon one reminds me of is there's a measurement issue as well, that our GDP statistics are just horrifically bad at capturing the value of free goods like Google, Facebook,
Right.
a lot of others.
You all shrink GDP. Did you realize that?
Yeah,
Stop it.
When you take Britannica and turn it into Wikipedia, GDP goes down, but welfare goes up. And Amazon is providing a lot more product variety, choice, timeliness, and none of those show up in the GDP statistics either. So we have a bit of a mismatch. If you go back to Simon Kuznets, who invented the GDP, one of the great inventions of the 20th century, Paul Samuelson said, one of the first things he said was, please do not use this as a measure of welfare. It is a measure of production. It's not a measure of how well we're doing. But of course, the first thing everybody started doing was assuming GDP equals welfare, and that's just mathematically wrong.
Yeah.
We should cut over to the Bhutanese model of gross national happiness.
Well, that may be going too far. I mean, I think one of the problems is that, the nice thing about GDP is you can measure it to like 9 significant digits, and it's very, very satisfying to be able to each quarter.
And you can decompose it into four other things
and
to
say,
9.
It went up 2 points. No, sorry, it was 2.4%. And gross national happiness. I'd be lucky if you get the first significant digit right.
Your comment about the aging population and productivity reminds me of a most astonishing statistic I've seen perhaps this year, that within 3 decades, if taking out Africa and population growth there, for the rest of the world, within 3 decades, the average age of humans on the planet Earth will be 60 years old.
Wow.
That is a dramatic change in the ratio of productive people in the workforce, unless your time in the workforce changes dramatically, and requires an awful lot more productivity to help adjust.
Well,
to it.
yeah, and there may be a good thing. Rod Brooks and others have really emphasized this, that let's bring on the robots as fast as we can so they can help take care of us in our old age.
Yeah. So, Andrew, question from the door?
All right, so we have a question from Miguel, who's in New York, and he asks, given your research on the rates of technological change, what are your thoughts on universal basic income? Re-educating everyone should be the goal, but if this can take years or not happen, given the emergence of multiple pilots, do you think of UBI as a potential solution?
Absolutely, people should be researching UBI. I think the experiments that are happening in Finland are really interesting. I think what Y Combinator is doing is pretty interesting. By all means, let's do the research. Let me tell you why I'm skeptical about a universal basic income. And it's extremely straightforward. A UBI, in its most classic form, provides no direct incentive, no direct encouragement to work. And as Erik and I have gone on with the work, I've become a fanatic about work, about the value, the importance of something like a job, not for some kind of old-fashioned Protestant work ethic reason, I don't think, but because the evidence is overwhelming that when work leaves a community, bad things happen, not good things. The research is just overwhelming on this. You see marriages fall apart You see couples not getting married. You see kids not being raised in nuclear homes. You can think, so what? You see crime going up. That's pretty unambiguous, so what? A lot of us know that Ann Deaton and Ann Cason's
Angus Deaton.
Angus Deaton and Ann Case highlighted this crazy phenomenon that we were unaware of until recently, that death rates, mortality rates among white middle-aged Americans are actually increasing instead of decreasing. And the reason they're increasing is because of what they call deaths of despair. Suicide, chronic liver disease, alcoholism, and drug overdoses. I can't tell a happy story about that. Those deaths of despair are really strongly concentrated in exactly the kinds of communities and demographics that are least likely to be working. So I think about that and I think which of those social problems will be fixed by a magical check from the government showing up every month? And my answer in that thought experiment is basically none.
And our friend Bob Putnam really helped educate us about these issues. But I want to underscore the first thing, and he said, we're all for experiments, and let's try some different things, because we can sit here in our chairs and say, hey, this is what we think motivates people. But the truth is there haven't been that many real tests of some of these theories, and it can be done in different ways. Norway has been fabulously successful with their oil wealth, giving people longer vacations, a lot of child care, taking care of people, and maintaining a pretty high level of satisfaction. Other oil-rich countries have not been as successful in navigating that level of wealth. So I think that there's clearly some devils in the details in terms of how you structure things and how you help people that can lead to very different kinds of outcomes.
The other thing to say on this point, this is a really fundamental question. Another reason that I'm not a fan of the UBI is because it might be a solution in a post-work world, in a world where we just don't need a lot of human labor. There is nothing in the evidence that says we're heading into that world yet. We've added net jobs in America month by month for, I believe, 75 months straight. And you can go graph the number of hours of labor required to generate America's economic output. It has gone up in lockstep with GDP ever since the end of the Great Recession. So when you look at the trend lines, you don't see any plateauing or leveling off. You don't see the end of work. I'll become a lot more excited about a UBI when the amount of labor hours needed to generate economic output starts to level off.
So America has high rates of labor mobility. Is that something we should be encouraging or discouraging?
Saying high rates?
High, relatively speaking.
Well, yeah, I think
Relatively,
actually,
So-
one of the concerns is that actually that number has been falling quite a bit. But go ahead.
So is it a good thing to encourage people to go where the jobs are? Or does that risk hollowing out the communities that Andy's talking about?
It's better than trying to will those communities back into existence if that's not going to work.
Absolutely. I think that one of the most misguided policies is trying to target land or geography rather than people. What we want to do is help the people. And if we can get them to match jobs to jobs better, match to work better, mobility is one of our best tools. And America, as you said, has historically been one of the most mobile societies, and it's becoming more and more stagnated and ossified, and that is exactly what we want to lean against. Some of our policies, I think, have a little backfired a little bit. We have big subsidies for home ownership, which sounds like a good thing, but it can lock people in to homes. And there are a lot of other barriers in terms of land use and regulation that have made it harder for people to move, and maybe there's some cultural things as well as communities have become more balkanized and stratified. So, if a group of people can find better work somewhere else, I say, hey, great, let's find a way to make it easy for them to find that and match it. And there are lots of places in America that have shortage of labor. There are other places that have surplus. Whether it's "Go West, young man" or whatever the slogan is, it's been part of the DNA of America to be dynamic in that way.
So it's weird that mobility, just moving around the country, is again on the decline in America. I think it's really hard to see when you sit in either Cambridge, Massachusetts or Silicon Valley, but almost any measure of business dynamism that you would care about is heading the wrong direction in America and has been for a while.
How many of the people in this room were born in Silicon Valley? I'm just kind of curious. Okay. So like 5 hands?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that, and it's great that not just Silicon Valley, but America has been a magnet for talent. And that's part of I wouldn't call it a secret sauce, because it's not really a secret. That's, it attracts the best and the brightest from around the world. And one of the things that really saddens me, just to be very specific to my area, is when we get these brilliant grad students that come from other countries, China, India, or wherever, and then they're finished their PhD and they want to stay, And the government says, no, you have to go back. We don't want you anymore. And they're like, no, no, we want to stay. And they're like, okay, go back. And they're like, well, okay, I guess I have a cousin working in Bangalore. I guess I'll go work with him or her. And eventually, they're not even going to want to come here anymore. And we'll have to beg them. And I think that's bad for the United States, and I think maybe bad for the world because you're not getting the optimal allocation of talent to where it can create value.
And I'll speak, for the home team, for America, this Kafkaesque nightmare that we've created, that we put in the way of some of the world's most talented and ambitious people who want to come to this country and build their lives and careers, that's what our enemies would do to us. It makes no sense to me.
The majority of people working in Silicon Valley were actually born outside the United States, so we're working to improve that. Question in front and then in back, please.
Sure. Coming back to the development.
Oh, we have a mic.
Oh, now we got mics. Technology improves.
Technology, wow. Coming back to the developing world for a second, you mentioned how automation may be more dangerous in manufacturing relying countries than in the United States, of course. I wanted your take on what strategies these countries should try and develop to anticipate that, and specifically if you think services can be an interesting path for growth in an era when the trade of services, I think, overpasses the trade in goods these days.
Yeah, it's a super tough question because the path to prosperity, or the path to being a middle-class country, was pretty clear in the 20th century. And to speak a little bit bluntly, you went through a sweatshop phase. You went through a phase of heavy industrialization. A decent portion of the population worked in manufacturing, in factories and sweatshops. And then over time, you developed a more robust economy, a more diverse one. Civil institutions came along with that. They became pretty healthy countries. We saw that playbook in the 20th century. Danny Roderick is a really good economist who has documented that playbook is looking less and less likely in the 21st century, mainly because of, we believe, robots, and to a lesser extent, the fact that we have tons of capacity in countries like America and China and Germany. So your question, which I'm really stalling on, is what's the new path to prosperity? And the reason I'm stalling is I don't think it's clear at all. I don't know about the template for the 21st century path to prosperity that doesn't include either a phase of industrialization or a resource endowment. What you say sounds right to me. It has to do with human capital and services that can be delivered over a distance. I don't know the shining example of that yet.
Well, for better or worse, I think, unfortunately, I think it has to be a playbook that's more and more similar to what developed countries have, because we're becoming globally and interconnected, which means you have to have an educated workforce that can deliver some kind of value that's greater than other people are delivering. And getting people up to speed on that is hard. There are some digital tools that can speed that process a bit, and so that's going to be part of it. There may be options in services that can help a little bit. Personal services tend to be localized, so then they are somewhat insulated from globalization. Yep. But it's a tough question, and one that I think we should worry about.
The clearest example, I think, is the Indian high-tech sector, which is a fairly small industry in a very, very big country. So I don't know how well that scales. But my playbook for the 21st century would be kind of, bathe your country in bandwidth, get cheap devices to the people, help point them the way toward these amazing educational resources online, and entrepreneurs will find that human capital and put it to work. That's easy to say and really hard to do.
Another example that's a little bit like that is the burgeoning O2O sector in places like China, online to offline, where these technologies have allowed lots of entrepreneurs to create many, many services, new kinds of products and services that wouldn't have been possible before. And so you have a explosion of small-scale entrepreneurship.
All right, so we're running up on time. I see two questions in back. Let's do a mini speed round. Why don't you both throw your questions out there and I'll let you
we'll answer quickly.
Okay. Well, I was wondering, when you said that there are a lot of jobs being created, are they manual labor or are they different kind of jobs? And what do you think the average person is going to do in 30 or 50 years, or whenever every manual labor is fully automated? Like, do you have any thoughts or ideas on that?
Yep, I'll try to do that one super quickly. The engine of job creation in America has downshifted from classic middle-class jobs to lower middle-class jobs. They tend to be service sector jobs. They tend to be jobs that involve doing work in the physical world. So home health aid, gardener, short order cook kinds of things. The robots can't do those jobs yet. Your question is, what does the world of work look like in 30 or 50 years of continued tech progress? I want to be clear, I have no idea.
And let me just append to Andy's answer. There's a big chunk of growth at one end. There's been kind of polarization. There's also been some very high-end jobs that's been created. It's the middle that's been hollowed out the worst. So there's high-end jobs like the ones people in this room. A lot of people who have creative, technical skills can command much higher wages. There's probably no better time in human history to be somebody with those kinds of skills or talent or luck. And there's no worse time to be someone with just routine middle-class skills that are increasingly automated.
Okay, one last question, the very back, I promised. I'm sorry, please.
I wanted to ask about like labor and capital and how this is affecting. So do you think this trend plays into that, where like corporate profits are at an all-time high and the wage share of the economy has been dropping? And do you think that like there's this U-shaped curve in labor where like low-skilled jobs are safe, very high-skilled jobs are safe, and middle-skilled jobs are kind of taking the fall? Or do you think it's like all of labor as a whole is going to take a fall compared to like the capital or the corporate profits?
The recent trend is fairly clear, and you pointed it out. It's increasing share of GDP going to capital and a decreasing share going to labor. For a lot of the post-war decades, we thought that capitalism was going to lead to greater equality of income and of financial outcomes. I don't believe that anymore. I think that the trend, like I said earlier, is toward concentration. There are things we can do about that. It's called redistribution. It's called tax and transfer. It's called wage subsidy. This is not an insolvable problem at all. And I am less bothered about that problem than some other people. But refusing to address it is the cardinal mistake.
And looking to the future, we have to be careful about just extrapolating what happened in the past. A lot of what happened in the past couple of decades was sort of the first wave of computerization, automating routine work, repetitive work. Looking forward to what artificial intelligence can do, there are a lot of other types of tasks. Someone mentioned manual tasks, some very creative work. Last night, Vinod was talking about oncologists and radiologists as jobs are being fixed, some very highly paid jobs.
Right.
So we may see a different thing going on. I think the only sure thing is that the pace of change is increasing, and we need to have a lot more flexibility. We need to be able to sense and respond and be active in how we do that, and not just sit back passively and thinking, well, I hope it works out for us, because we think there's a lot of things that we can do as individuals, as organizations, as a society to help shape the path we're going towards. And if we do this right, this is going to be the best thing that's ever happened to humanity. We're going to have a lot more wealth, a lot less need for work. We're going to have healthier people, but there's absolutely no guarantee that we will hit on all of those dimensions. It's quite possible we can have a much more dystopian scenario where there's a tremendous concentration of wealth and other outcomes that we aren't as happy with. But ultimately, it's not the choice of technology. It's going to be our choices that determine that. And the reason we wrote these books was to help provide a little bit of guidance on what some of our options are. And then we have to apply our values and see if we want to go in that direction.
This is the headline to end on, and this is awesome. Overall human prosperity is about to increase even faster than it's been doing. We're heading into a different chapter. If we blow the distribution, the sharing of that prosperity, shame on us.
Andy, Erik, Machine Platform Crowd, your guide to the 21st century. Thank you very much.
Ken, thanks a lot. Thank you all for coming.
Appreciate it.